Your fever starts on a Tuesday. It is nothing, a chill, so you drink something hot and go to bed. By Wednesday, your head is splitting. By Thursday, you cannot stand, and the sweat soaks the sheet, and nobody is coming. No ambulance, no clinic, no lit emergency room. There is no building in your town whose whole job is to take you in. The year is 1348. You live in Florence, and the plague has come. Within months, it will take a third of the city, maybe half, and no one is counting yet. Boccaccio watched it happen. He wrote down what he saw, and what he saw was abandonment. Sick people left alone in their houses. Neighbors who stopped knocking on the door. Fathers and mothers, he writes, refused to visit their own children. Servants asked mad money, then died beside them. Pigs nosed at the rags of a dead pauper and dropped dead in the road. Take his numbers loosely, but take his fear seriously. Somewhere between a third and a half of Florence died in roughly 2 years. There was no hospital to carry the dying to, and barely anyone to carry them out. The town of Pistoia, 20 miles away, answered with paperwork. In May of that year, its council issued plague ordinances you can read today. No one from infected places let in, no linen carried out of a dead man's house. Funerals kept short, bells kept quiet, graves dug deep. It reads like a modern emergency order, because that is what it is. They had no medicine, so they had rules. Now bring it home. If the same failure hit your street tomorrow, no hospital, no clinic, no doctor who picks up the phone who walks through your door. Somebody has to, and somebody always has. That is the question of this story, not how people survived without hospitals, because that question is too small. The better question is this: who was expected to care, and what did caring cost them? Because the obstacle was enormous. Sickness never stopped, and it didn't wait for a system. Fevers, wounds, childbirth, stones, rot, plague every week, every street, every town. No training schools, no salaries, no germ theory. By every law of common sense, care should have collapsed under the weight of it. People should have died alone, in droves, behind locked doors. Some did, most didn't. And the reason they didn't is one of the strangest stories in ordinary life. Start where everyone started, at home. For almost all of human history, the sickbed was a bed, and it stood in your own house. Your bed, in your room, with your family around it. Care wasn't a place you went to. Care was a person who stayed. Mostly, that person was a woman, your mother, your wife, your daughter, your sister. She did the nursing the way she did the cooking. She changed the linen and made the possets. She sat up through the bad nights, and there were always bad nights. The sick room had its own weather windows shut against the night air, a fire kept in, the curtains drawn round the bed, and in the dark, at some hour when the house was silent, she put a hand on your forehead to read the fever. Everyone alive then knew that touch the first instrument of medicine, and it cost nothing. No one ever wrote down how often it happened. The record goes quiet there. We have account books, wills, court rolls, but we don't have the night watch. The women who did the nursing left almost no words of their own. What we do have are their remedy books. In England, gentlewomen kept thick manuscript books of receipts, recipes for medicine and food side by side. A water for sore eyes, a poultice for a swelling, a cordial for a weak stomach. Open one at random and you find snail water for consumption, aqua vitae for faintness, a syrup of violets for a hot liver. The ingredients came from the garden, the still room, and the apothecary's shelf, and the method came from whoever taught you mother, mistress, neighbor, book. Some of these books passed from mother to daughter for a century, each generation adding its notes in the margins. A printed one, Gervase Markham's The English Huswife of 1615, put surgery and physic between the cookery and the dairy. Some remedies were useless, some were worse, and some worked. Willow bark tea dulls pain and brings down fever. We now know the bark holds the same family of chemical as aspirin. Honey on a wound keeps it cleaner than most things in a medieval house. They didn't know why, they knew it helped, and that had to be enough. The theory above it all came from Galen, a Greek doctor of the 2nd century whose books ruled medicine for well over 1,000 years. 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health was balance, and sickness was imbalance. So you bled the patient, or purged him, or fed him cooling foods against a hot fever. It was a whole system, logical on its own terms, and mostly wrong. But notice what it did. It gave the family something to do. A fever at home is terror. but a fever with a plan is work, and work calms people. Birth belonged to the house too. A woman gave birth in her own room, in a lying-in chamber hung with cloth, attended by a midwife and a ring of neighbors and kin. The women at a birth were called her gossips from godsibs, her sisters in God, and the word only later slid downhill into idle talk. Birth killed often enough that every town knew it. Childbed fever took mothers in the week after, and nobody knew why. And the funeral sometimes followed the christening by days. After a birth came the churching, a short rite of thanks for a mother who had survived, and women walked to it in their best clothes. Survival was an event. It was marked. Death belonged to the house as well. People died in their beds, with the family in the room, and the priest sent for. Then the women washed the body and laid it out, and the parish account might pay a stranger a few pence for the laying out. The wake was held at home, and the coffin left by the front door. The whole event happened within 50 feet of where it began. And when the family couldn't cope, the net widened. Neighbors came. Sitting with the sick was a duty, like mourning was a duty. In some parishes, the neighbors took turns at the night watch, 2 hours each, so no one household broke under a long sickness. The watch's jobs were plain: cool the drink, change the cloth, note the hour the fever turned, and send for the priest if it turned the wrong way. Later, in England, the law made it official. The Poor Law of 1601 made each parish answerable for its own poor, and parish account books survive that show the machinery in plain ink. Payments to a woman for nursing a sick widow, money for coal for a fevered man's room. It was welfare at the scale of a street, run by amateurs, paid out of local rates. Slow, patchy, unfair, and real. The disease stayed in the house, so the care stayed with it. The house ran on women, and the women ran on habit. Habit was cheaper than doctors. Habit was there at 3 in the morning, and habit was the only medicine most people ever got. The hospital didn't invent care, it gathered it. You could also buy care, and that part gets forgotten. Towns were full of people who healed for money, and most of them weren't doctors. There was no referral, no appointment slip, no bill that arrived later. You found the healer your neighbor used. You asked what it cost, and you paid in coin or in kind. The university physician was rare and expensive, a man in a long gown who read Latin and judged your urine flask from a distance. Uroscopy, they called it. The color, the cloudiness, the sediment, a whole diagnosis from a glass bottle. Sometimes the flask was never even near the patient. It arrived by messenger, like a sample sent to a lab. Everyone else went to everyone else. The apothecary sold the drugs. In London, the apothecaries won their own guild in 1617, split off from the grocers, and their shops were dense little warehouses. Dried herbs in jars, roots in drawers, powders and syrups and plasters on shelves. And theriac, the famous treacle, made of dozens of ingredients, a formulary the length of a small spreadsheet, kept locked like bullion. Venice made its own and guarded the recipe like a state secret. A year after the guild came the London Pharmacopoeia of 1618, which told every apothecary in the city what went into each preparation, and inspectors could seize bad drugs and burn them in the street. Quality control, Tudor style. The midwife handled birth. In England, she could be licensed by the bishop, an actual license, from a church court, after local women testified to her skill and her character. A paperwork trail for a job done with bare hands. Then came the specialists, and here the written record thins out very fast. Bone setters, tooth drawers, itinerant cutters who traveled fair to fair. The cataract coucher pushed the cloudy lens aside with a needle, and if it worked, a blind person saw again within minutes. The cutter for the stone did the most feared operation in Europe, and the best of them finished in under a minute, because speed was the only mercy on offer. At the fairs, tooth drawers worked on stages with drums and trumpets. The noise had a purpose. It drowned the screaming. Nobody recorded how many of the couched could see clearly a year later. The cutter moved on to the next fair, and the record moved on with him. The word mountebank comes from the Italian for mount on bench, because that is what he did up on a bench in the market square, patter running, bottle held high. He sold the same hope as everyone else, with better lighting. Below all of these sat the wise woman and the cunning man. Charms, herbs, a word over the wound paid in eggs, paid in pennies, paid in thanks. We tend to laugh at this layer, and we shouldn't. Or not all of it. Their customers weren't stupid. Their customers were desperate, and desperate people buy hope wherever it is sold in any century, including ours. When plague emptied the labor market, the price of care jumped. Defoe says London nurses asked wages that would have bought a small shop, and parish accounts elsewhere show the same spike in plain numbers. Risk had a market rate, everyone knew it, and nobody called it that. To see how strange the trade could get, meet Tom. Tom is invented, let's be clear on that. He is a barber's apprentice in London in the 1530s, and he stands in for every apprentice who ever swept a floor with blood in it. His master cuts hair, shaves chins, pulls teeth, and lets blood all four. Same shop, same chair, same blades, and Tom's jobs are worse. He sharpens the lancets and warms the water. He sweeps the hair and the blood and tries not to think on the mixture. Apprenticeships ran 7 years. 7 years of lancets and lather before Tom could touch a paying chin. He learns early to keep the basin below the windowsill. Customers who saw the basin stopped being customers. The lancet opened a vein at the elbow, and the blood ran into a basin marked with rings to measure the ounces. 12 ounces was a common order. You can hold a 12-ounce glass yourself and feel how much that is. In 1540, Parliament joined the barbers and the surgeons into one company by act, and then drew a line down the middle of your chin. Barbers could pull teeth and nothing more. Surgeons could cut you open, but no shaving. Each trade was forbidden the other's razor. A man could be legally too coarse to shave you and legally fined to open your belly. Tom's world ran on rules like that. His exam, when it came, would be oral before masters of the company. With questions in Latin he half knew. Fail, and you stayed an apprentice. Pass, and you could hang a basin of your own. The story usually told of his trade's famous sign goes like this. The patient gripped a staff during a bleeding, and the bandages twisted round it dried in the air. White cloth, red blood, wooden pole. The story can't be proved. The pole hung outside barbers' shops for centuries anyway. The only surgical instrument you can still get a haircut under, anywhere at all. Now the surprise. Hospitals existed long before you think. The word hospital comes from hospitality, and the first ones were guest houses for people nobody wanted to host. The Greek word for such a house was xenodokion, a place for strangers, and bishops were urged to keep one. In the late 4th century, a Roman widow named Fabiola shocked her class. We know her from a letter by Jerome, the great scholar, written to a friend after her death. Fabiola gathered the sick out of the streets of Rome and carried them herself. She washed their sores and fed them, Jerome says, when they were too far gone to feed themselves. Her house for them is often called the first public hospital in the Latin West. She paid for it by selling her own property. Her example spread, and within a generation such houses stood in several cities of the empire. A century and more later, a monk wrote the rule that carried the idea everywhere. The Rule of Benedict, chapter 36, gives one plain order. Before all things and above all things, care must be taken of the sick. Monasteries across Europe took it literally. Interior doors opened off quiet cloisters. Every great house had an infirmary, an infirmarian in charge, special diets, a room set apart for the dying. Monks were bled on schedule, a few times a year, like maintenance on a bell, and the gates took in travelers, pilgrims, the poor, the sick, with no house of their own. One religious order took its very name from a hospital. The Knights of St. John ran a great hospital in Jerusalem from the 1100s, and travelers called them the Hospitallers. The ward there, the travelers said, took in the poor sick of any creed. The order outlived the kingdom around it. Outside the gates stood the lazar houses, the leper hospitals. Leprosy filled Europe with fear, and the answer was separation with a roof. England alone had a few hundred of these houses, by the usual medieval count. Were they hospitals or prisons? Historians argue it both ways, even now. The inmates had land of their own, food, prayers, and rules. They also had a bell or a clapper to warn the healthy away, and the whole arrangement ran on small rents and small gifts. Comfort and quarantine in the same walls, both at once. The sources don't settle it. Then, in the cities of the Islamic world, something bigger appeared. The Bimaristan, the word means house of the sick, was a true hospital. Wards, physicians on salary, a pharmacy, teaching. Nur al-Din built a famous one in Damascus in 1154, with separate wards for different sicknesses and physicians paid from the endowment, and the building stands today. In Cairo, the Sultan Qalawun built his in 1284, and the endowment deed survives, and it reads like a charter from another century. Free treatment for anyone, rich or poor, food, medicine, bedding, musicians to calm the patients, and when a patient left, money for new clothes, so he didn't walk out destitute. The chroniclers say Kalawan fell ill in Damascus, was cured by medicine from Nur al-Din's hospital, and vowed to build one if he lived. He lived. The deed is there to read. Hold this line, because the whole story hangs on it. The hospital didn't invent care. It gathered it. Why did these places appear where and when they did? 3 answers compete, and the honest move is to leave them standing. 1. Charity. Religion taught that the sick stranger was holy, and care bought merit. 2. Control. Cities feared contagion and disorder, and a wall with beds inside it solved both. 3. Need. Towns grew too big for the household net, and strangers fell sick with no kin for 100 miles. Each explains some of the map, and none explains all of it. Pick your favorite. The archive won't crown it. Paris claims the oldest hospital in the West, the Hôtel Dieu, beside the cathedral, dated by tradition to 651. Tradition is doing some work in that sentence, but the hospital is documented solidly in the centuries after. Augustinian sisters nursed there for generation on generation, hundreds of beds and thousands of patients a year by the early modern period, it is believed. The beds were shared, 2 and sometimes 3 to a mattress, which says hard things on crowding and simple things on warmth. In England, the whole monastic floor gave way at once. Between 1536 and 1541, Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, and with them went the infirmaries, the almshouses, the guest halls. Londoners petitioned the crown for their hospitals back. It worked, partly. St. Bartholomew's, founded in 1123 by a courtier named Rahir who fell sick on pilgrimage and made a vow, was refounded by royal charter in 1546 and handed to the city. The same site treats patients now. And in 1443, in Beaune, in Burgundy, a chancellor named Nicolas Rollin and his wife Gigonne founded a hospital you can walk into today. A great hall with a roof like an upturned ship, rows of red curtain beds down both walls, a chapel at the end, so the dying could hear mass from their pillows. The beds had pewter tableware and white linen, because Rollin's gift came with standards, and the accounts show the laundry bills to prove it. Rollin paid for it with vineyards, and here is the part that sounds invented and isn't. The vineyards fund it to this day. Every November, the wines go under the hammer, as they have since 1859. A hospital kept alive by grapes, the only endowment that improves in the barrel. A vow became a building. The building needed money. Money became an endowment, and the endowment hired hands. The hands fed strangers, and the stranger got a bed at last. But the household and the charity ward shared one blind spot: contagion. When plague came, care itself became the weapon. The person who stayed by the bed caught what the bed held. In 542, the plague reached Constantinople, and the historian Procopius was inside the city walls. He says that at the peak, the dead ran to 10,000 a day. The number is surely swollen. Ancient writers reached for round terror, but the mass graves dug outside medieval cities say the scale was real. Procopius watched the Emperor Justinian detail men to clear corpses from the streets and the harbors. Care didn't fail there. Care was overrun. And that wave was only the first of a pandemic that circled the Mediterranean for 2 centuries, on and off, into the 750s. The Black Death returned the lesson 100 times over, and out of that terror came the one invention we reach for every time a new disease appears: distance. Milan took the hardest line in 1348. The chroniclers say the Visconti lords ordered houses with plague inside them walled up outright, the well and the sick together. Whether it happened as often as the chroniclers claim, nobody can say. Milan lost fewer people than its neighbors. Draw your own line between those 2 facts. In 1377, the port of Ragusa Dubrovnik on the Adriatic passed a law we can read to this day. Ships and travelers from infected places had to wait apart for 30 days before entering. 30 days? The Trentino? Venice went further. In 1423, the city set aside an island for the sick and their goods, the first lazaretto, named for the hospital of Santa Maria de Nazareth. Later, the wait stretched to 40 days. 40 giorni, quarantine. You know the word. The whole world relearned it a few years ago. It is a medieval customs rule with salt on it. England wrote its own version in terror and ink. London printed weekly bills of mortality, the city's death ledger, parish by parish, cause by cause. The bills were sold in the streets for a penny, and households read them the way we read weather. The counting was done by searchers, women, usually old, usually poor, appointed to view corpses and name the killer. Paid a few pence a body. Their guesses weren't medicine, but their guesses were data. In 1662, a draper named John Graunt turned the bills into the first statistics of life and death ever published. Graunt counted christenings and burials, found that more boys were born than girls, and showed that plague years stood out like mountains on a flat chart. A shopkeeper, counting the dead, built a science in his spare time. The policy on the ground was cruder. A plague house was shut up. Red cross on the door. Lord have mercy upon us, written over it. A watchman outside, day and night, and everyone inside trapped with the sick. Daniel Defoe described it all in his Journal of the Plague Year, written in 1722, decades later, by a man who was a child in 1665, but built on records and memory. Read it as a researched reconstruction, not a diary. By the 1600s, English towns were also building pest houses, plain sheds at the edge of the fields where the sick poor could be sent to sweat it out away from everyone else. The pest house was the boundary made of brick, half clinic, half fence. Then there is Ayam. In September 1665, a parcel of cloth arrived from London at a tailor's house in that Derbyshire village. The village had perhaps 350 souls when the cloth arrived. The cloth carried fleas. The tailor's assistant, George Vickers, was dead within days. The rector, William Mompesson, did the thing that made the village famous. He persuaded his people to seal themselves in, no one out. Food came from outside, left at the village edge. Payment went back in, coins dropped into holes in a boundary stone, soaked in vinegar against the infection. 6 holes, bored into gritstone, each no bigger than a teacup. Mompesson sent his children away to safety. His wife Catherine refused to leave, and she died in the village in August 1666. The arrangement held for over a year. Roughly 260 villagers died, perhaps 3 out of 4 of the people who lived there. Their names are in the parish register, and the register survives. Fear shut the gates. The gates made a boundary. The boundary needed rules, and the rules needed watchers. The watchers needed pay, and the bill came to the parish in the end. So what is left of all this? More than you'd guess, and you can go and stand in it. The Great Hall at Beaune takes visitors. Beds made up in red, the Van der Weyden altarpiece in its chapel, the auction every November. In Cairo, Qalawun's complex rises over the street called Bain al-Kasrain, and historians quote its deed line by line. In Damascus, Nur al-Din's Bimaristan is a museum of medicine. In London, St. Bartholomew's has treated patients on the same Smithfield ground since 1123. And in a wet field outside Ayam, the boundary stone sits with its 6 holes, and people walk out to look at it. We kept more than buildings. We kept the word quarantine and the instinct behind it. We kept the weekly count of the dead, and every national statistics office is John Graunt's child. We kept the pest house at the edge of town, which grew into the fever hospital and then the isolation ward. We kept the long ward itself, beds down both walls. And we kept the oldest layer of all, the one under every system ever built. Nursing somebody who stays. Professional nursing, the kind with training and a register, grew straight out of those religious wards. Florence Nightingale opened her training school at St. Thomas's Hospital in 1860. The profession has degrees and unions now. The core act is Fabiola's act, and your mother's. Stay in the room. What it cost to get here was everything the old system couldn't do. Surgery without sepsis, birth without terror, contagion met with knowledge instead of vinegar, anesthesia, antisepsis, antibiotics, each one arrived late, and each one moved the odds. The household net was loving, and it wasn't enough, and both halves of that sentence are true. 3 things nearly everyone believes on this story are wrong. First, that there were no hospitals before the modern age. You've seen why that's false. Damascus, Cairo, Paris, bone wards, salaries, endowments, rules. The modern hospital is a descendant, not an invention. Second, that the church banned surgery and dissection, which is why barbers did the cutting. Historians have chased this one for years. The famous ban, a council's phrase on the church abhorring blood, was aimed at clergy, not medicine. Dissection happened in medieval universities, documented on the record. The barbers did surgery for a duller reason. Guild economics. Somebody had to hold the razor, and the razor men were cheaper than the gown men. Third, the beaked plague doctor, stalking medieval streets. The costume is real, but it isn't medieval. It was designed in 1619 by Charles Delorme, a physician to Kingsbeak stuffed with herbs against the bad air, waxed coat, glass over the eyes. Most of the pictures you know are later engravings. The great plagues it gets pictured in were centuries dead by then. We put the beak in the wrong century, and we do that with most of the past. So, your fever starts on a Tuesday. You know now what the old answer was. A hand in the dark, a neighbor at the door, a woman paid in pennies, a monk with a diet sheet, a stranger behind a wall of charity, a village sealing its gates and paying the price. Layer on layer of improvised duty, patched together over centuries, with no one in charge of the whole. The hospital didn't invent care, it gathered it. It took the hand, the neighbor, the nurse, the monk, the stranger, and put a roof over them and a ledger under them. It wasn't one invention, it was 1,000 small obligations made solid. And Tom, our invented apprentice, swept his floor, passed his exam, hung the pole outside the shop, and never once guessed he was standing at the edge of a long story. The basin is gone, the pole remains. Care was never a building, it was whoever stayed in the room. The fever will come on a Tuesday, and a hand you know will find your forehead in the dark.